Lemberg, the Pearl of Galicia, a city of many cultures and peoples. In August 1914, its streets still breathed the familiar rhythm of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Majestic Art Nouveau buildings, Polish churches, Ukrainian churches, and Jewish synagogues created the unique character of the city, for which a brutal struggle would soon unfold. Lemberg's strategic position made it the key to controlling all of eastern Galicia, a rich province at the crossroads of empires. For Vienna, the city was an eastern outpost, a showcase of imperial power. For Petrograd, it was historical Russian land that needed to be reclaimed. When the flame of the World War engulfed Europe, Russian troops under the command of General Ruski began a rapid offensive on Galicia. Opposing them was the army of Archduke Friedrich, ready to defend the crown lands to the last soldier. None of the inhabitants of multinational Lemberg suspected that their city would become the arena of one of the first large-scale battles of the Great War, which changed the destinies of entire peoples. Galicia, at the beginning of the 20th century, represented a true geopolitical apple of discord between great empires. This territory, located on the northeastern slopes of the Carpathians, was historically at the crossroads of interests of several powers. After the partitions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at the end of the 18th century, Galicia passed to the Austrian Empire, becoming one of its key provinces in the east. For the Habsburg monarchy, this region was not merely a territorial acquisition. It served as a buffer between the empire and the growing power of the Russian state, as well as a source of resources and recruits. By the beginning of the First World War, Galicia had transformed into a strategic springboard, control over which opened the way both to the heart of Austria-Hungary and to the western provinces of the Russian Empire. Lemberg, as the administrative center of the region, acquired particular significance in the plans of the general staffs of the warring parties. For Vienna, the loss of the city would mean not only military defeat, but also a serious political blow, capable of undermining the authority of power within the multinational empire. For Petrograd, the capture of Lemberg would be a triumphant step towards the reunification of the so-called primordial Russian lands and the strengthening of positions in the Slavic world. The ethnic composition of Galicia made the situation even more complex. Poles, who constituted a significant part of the urban population and landowners, Ukrainians, who predominated in rural areas, Jews, Germans, and other nationalities created a complex mosaic of interests and contradictions. Austrian authorities skillfully used the principle of divide and rule, maintaining a balance between Polish and Ukrainian political forces. The Russian Empire, in turn, relied on pan-Slavic ideology, presenting itself as the protector of all Slavic peoples from German domination. In military strategic terms, Galicia had exceptional importance for both empires. The developed railway network allowed for the rapid transfer of troops, and the Carpathian passes created a natural defensive line. The Austro-Hungarian command viewed this region as an ideal springboard for an offensive on Kiev and further into Ukraine. The Russian General Staff saw Galicia as the gateway to the Hungarian plain and further to Vienna. With the outbreak of the World War, these theoretical calculations began to materialize in real combat operations. A particular piquancy to the situation was added by the fact that many Galician Poles and Ukrainians found themselves on opposite sides of the front, forced to fight against each other as part of the Austrian and Russian armies. For them, the battle for Lemberg became not just part of a major war, but also a personal drama that divided families and destroyed centuries-old ties. The economic significance of the region also cannot be underestimated. The oil fields of Drohobych and Borislav, the salt mines of Wieliczka, and fertile Chernozems made Galicia an attractive prize. In the conditions of a protracted war, control over these resources could significantly affect the ability of the empires to continue military operations. On the eve of the decisive battle for Lemberg, the opposing forces feverishly prepared for a clash that could change the course of the entire eastern campaign. The Russian Imperial Army deployed impressive forces in the Galician direction. 4 armies, totaling about 800,000 men. General Ruski's 3rd Army and General Brusilov's 8th Army directly targeted Lemberg. Nikolai Vladimirovich Ruski, a 59-year-old general of infantry, was known as a thoughtful strategist and methodical commander. He had experience from the Russo-Japanese War, where he gained valuable lessons on the importance of maneuver and troop coordination. Alexei Alexeyevich Brusilov, commander of the 8th Army, was distinguished by innovative thinking and a deep understanding of cavalry tactics. Both generals had excellent artillery at their disposal, including 3-inch field guns of the 1902 model, which were not inferior in their characteristics to the best European counterparts. The Russian infantry was armed with reliable Mosin rifles, but was inferior to the enemy in the number of machine guns and shells per gun. A peculiarity of the Russian troops was the high resilience of the infantry, but insufficient flexibility of control at the corps and division levels. The forces of the Danubian monarchy countered the Russian offensive with the 1st, 3rd, and 4th armies, totaling about 700,000 men. The Austro-Hungarian forces were led by Chief of the General Staff Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf, a brilliant theoretician, but sometimes an overly self-confident practitioner. His plan envisioned offensive actions with the goal of defeating Russian forces before their full concentration. The commander of the 3rd Army, General Rudolf Brudermann, who was directly defending Lemberg, was known as a cautious and methodical military leader. Austro-Hungarian troops were armed with excellent Skoda field howitzers, rapid-fire Schwarzlose machine guns, and modern Mannlicher magazine rifles. Their advantage was a more developed field communications system and better training of the officer corps. However, the multinational composition of the army created problems with unity of command and the morale of some units. In the last days before the clash, both sides feverishly improved their defensive positions. The Austrians created an echeloned defense on the approaches to the city, using commanding heights. Russian troops advanced by forced marches to the line of contact, striving to seize the initiative. Intelligence data continuously flowed to the opposing headquarters, but was often contradictory. Both sides underestimated the enemy's strength and overestimated their own capabilities. The local population became involved in the preparations for the battle. Poles and Ukrainians were mobilized into the Austrian army. Many served as guides and informants for both sides. The air was filled with a premonition of a grand battle that was to decide the fate of all Galicia. In the pre-dawn twilight of September 3, 1914, Russian troops launched a decisive offensive on Lemberg. The silence of the Galician hills was shattered by the roar of artillery. General Rutski's batteries opened hurricane fire on the advanced positions of the Austrians. An hour after the start of the artillery preparation, the infantry regiments rose to the attack. The 3rd Army advanced from the northeast, while parts of Brusilov's 8th Army enveloped the city from the south, threatening encirclement. The first clashes showed the superiority of Russian tactics. General Rutski skillfully used the terrain, directing the main blows to the junctions between Austrian units. Particularly successful was General Shkinsky's 21st Corps, which, with a swift thrust, captured key heights near the village of Kulikov, opening a direct path to Lemberg. The Austrian units, despite well-prepared defensive positions, could not withstand the powerful onslaught and began to retreat. Russian artillery methodically suppressed enemy firing points, allowing the infantry to advance with minimal losses. By midday, advanced detachments of Russian cavalry had already reached the outskirts of the city. The command of the Austro-Hungarian army was caught off guard by the swiftness of the Russian offensive. General Brudermann, commanding the defense of Lemberg, urgently requested reinforcements from Konrad von Hötzendorf. However, the chief of the general staff was preoccupied with his own offensive plans in the northern sector of the front and could not quickly redeploy reserves. The Austrian command attempted to organize a counterattack with the forces of the 12th Infantry Division from the Vereshchitsa River line, but Russian intelligence timely detected the concentration of troops. The artillery fire of Russian batteries disrupted the preparation of the counterattack, inflicting significant losses on the Austrians even before the start of their maneuver. By the evening of the first day of the offensive, Russian troops had advanced 12 kilometers, occupying strategically important heights and cutting several railway lines connecting Lemberg with the rear. Ruski's tactical success was evident. His army demonstrated excellent coordination between branches of service. Cossack patrols were particularly effective, penetrating deep into the enemy's rear, creating panic and disrupting communications. The Austrian command, realizing the scale of the threat, began a hasty regrouping of forces. General Brudermann ordered the abandonment of the outer belt of fortifications and the concentration of defense on the immediate approaches to the city. Elite Hungarian regiments, famous for their steadfastness in defense, were brought up from the reserve. In the southern direction, the Austrians managed to temporarily stabilize the front, using pre-prepared positions on the hills. However, on the northern flank, the Russian offensive continued to develop successfully. Cossack units of General Dragomirov reached the rear of the main Austrian grouping, threatening encirclement. By the end of the second day of the offensive, Russian troops had approached the city outskirts. General Ruski, having received reports on the enemy's condition, decided not to give the Austrians a respite and to continue the offensive without an operational pause. This decision proved correct. The Austrian command did not have time to react to the rapidly changing situation. On the morning of September 5th, Russian troops began the assault on the city's suburbs. Fierce battles unfolded for the railway station and industrial areas. Austrian sappers tried to blow up key bridges, but the actions of Russian reconnaissance groups thwarted most of these attempts. By the end of the first week of September 1914, the situation for Austro-Hungarian troops near Lemberg was becoming critical. Russian armies under Generals Ruski and Brusilov were methodically tightening the encirclement around the city. It was at this moment that the chief of the Austrian General Staff, Franz Konrad von Hötzendorf, made a decision that changed the dynamics of the entire battle. Having drawn reserves from other sectors of the front and transferring 2 fresh divisions from deep within the rear, Hötzendorf prepared a powerful counterattack against the extended flanks of the Russian forces. The operation was codenamed Iron Fist. The Austrian command relied on surprise and concentration of forces on a narrow sector of the front. Early in the morning of September 7th, when fog still enveloped the Galician hills, Austrian artillery opened a hurricane of fire on the positions of the Russian 8th Army. Over 200 guns unleashed a barrage of shells on Russian trenches and observation posts. Simultaneously, elite Hungarian and Tyrolean units launched a decisive offensive on the southern flank. General Brusilov, commanding this sector, was caught off guard not so much by the fact of the counterattack itself, but by its sheer power. The Austrians managed to break through the first line of defense and threatened to encircle a significant grouping of Russian troops. The situation was complicated by the fact that Ruski had by this time already committed almost all his reserves to battle. Hötzendorf personally coordinated the actions of the Udarnaya grouping, being at the command post near the front line. His tactical plan was to cleave the Russian forces into 2 parts and destroy them separately. A special role in the operation was played by Austrian cavalry, which carried out a daring raid behind Russian lines, disrupting supply and communication. By midday, the Austrian counterattack achieved maximum success. The wedge driven into Russian positions reached a depth of 15 kilometers. Several Russian regiments found themselves semi-encircled, and supply lines were cut. General Ruski was forced to urgently transfer units from the northern flank, weakening the pressure on Lemberg itself. However, the Austrian success proved short-lived. The Russian command showed enviable composure in the critical situation. Brusilov, assessing the situation, organized a counterattack with his reserve corps against the flank of the breakthrough Austrian grouping. Simultaneously, the artillery of the Third Army concentrated fire on the identified concentrations of Austrian troops. Urban battles in Lemberg became a true laboratory for the military art of the early 20th century. When Russian troops entered the city's outskirts, the nature of the battle changed dramatically. The wide maneuvers of field warfare gave way to a methodical, painstaking struggle for every block, every building. The Austrian command transformed the city into a fortified area, utilizing the peculiarities of urban development. Massive stone buildings became improvised fortresses, and narrow streets, deadly traps for attacking units. Spanish military observers present at the battle subsequently compiled detailed reports that significantly influenced European military thought. Colonel Manuel Garcia particularly noted the innovative tactical techniques employed by both sides. Russian troops quickly adapted to urban conditions, dividing into assault groups of 5 to 7 men. Each such group included grenadiers with hand grenades, riflemen, and sappers. They advanced from building to building, avoiding open spaces and using breaches in walls instead of doors and windows, which were swept by defenders' fire. The Austrians, in turn, created an effective system of multi-layered defense. The lower floors of buildings were turned into machine gun nests, the upper ones into observation posts and sniper positions. Cellars were connected by improvised tunnels, allowing for covert movement of reinforcements and ammunition. Particularly fierce fighting unfolded for the railway station, a strategic hub controlling transport flows. For 3 days, the majestic Art Nouveau building changed hands. Russian soldiers, lacking experience in urban combat, initially suffered heavy losses, attacking in dense formations. However, they quickly learned. Officers ordered the use of smoke screens and diversionary maneuvers, which reduced the effectiveness of Austrian machine guns. Spanish Major Rodriguez, in his notes, pointed out the revolutionary use of artillery by the Russians in urban conditions. Light field guns were brought directly into the infantry's combat formations and fired direct shots at fortified buildings. This was risky for the crews but had a powerful effect, destroying enemy defensive positions. The Austrians countered this by mining key objects and setting up barricades that channeled the attackers into prepared kill zones. During the battles for Lemberg, a new tactic of clearing buildings was born. Russian sappers developed a method of sequential advancement from top to bottom, by capturing the roof and methodically moving to the lower floors. This allowed them to neutralize the advantage of the defenders and minimize their own losses. The Austrian command, in turn, for the first time widely used lone snipers, operating autonomously and incapacitating enemy officers and signalmen. The civilian population of Lemberg found itself in a terrifying situation. Many residents took refuge in basements, suffering from a lack of water and food. City services were paralyzed. Fires broke out that no one extinguished. Both warring parties tried to minimize civilian casualties, but in the conditions of fierce street fighting, this was virtually impossible. Spanish observers noted that the experience of Lemberg demonstrated the need for special training of troops for urban battles, which differed significantly from field battles both in tactics and in the psychological impact on soldiers. Behind the scenes of the grand clash near Lemberg, an equally dramatic battle of intelligence agencies unfolded. While cannons roared on the battlefields, secret agents waged their invisible war, upon which depended the fates of thousands of soldiers and the outcome of the entire campaign. Before the operation began, Russian military intelligence had established an extensive network of informants in Galicia. Colonel Sergei Markovich Dukhonin, who headed the intelligence department of the Southwestern Front's staff, managed to embed his agents even in the immediate entourage of the Austrian command. Of particular value were reports from an agent codenamed, quote, Zero, a Czech officer serving at General Brudermann's headquarters. It was thanks to his information that the Russian command received detailed maps of Lemberg's defensive structures with marked firing positions and ammunition depots. Austro-Hungarian intelligence, led by Colonel Max Rong, was also not idle. Its agents actively worked among the Polish and Ukrainian populations, creating sabotage groups in the rear of the advancing Russian troops. One of the most successful operations of Austrian counterintelligence was the identification and neutralization of a Russian spy network in Lemberg itself on the eve of the battle. 26 agents were arrested, which significantly weakened the Russian command's awareness of the situation in the city. British observers, seconded to the Russian army, surprisingly noted the innovative intelligence-gathering methods employed by both sides. Major Alfred Knox, in his dispatches to London, particularly highlighted the Russians' use of airplanes for aerial reconnaissance of enemy positions, a technology just beginning its development. Pilots risked their lives, descending to dangerous altitudes to take clear photographs of Austrian fortifications. Radio intelligence proved equally important. Both sides actively intercepted and deciphered enemy radio messages. Russian cryptographers managed to break several Austrian ciphers, providing invaluable information about troop movements and planned operations. The Austrians, in turn, frequently changed codes and used false messages for disinformation. Cases of espionage and sabotage multiplied with each day of the battle. Agents, disguised in enemy uniforms, infiltrated behind the front lines. Saboteurs blew up bridges and railway tracks, disrupting troop supply. One of the most daring episodes occurred when a group of Austrian agents who spoke Russian without an accent infiltrated a Russian division's headquarters and stole operational maps with plans for an offensive. Both sides actively used the local population to gather intelligence. Galician peasants, who knew every path, served as guides for reconnaissance groups. City dwellers transmitted information about troop movements through a complex system of conditional signals. Even children became unwitting participants in this secret war, delivering notes hidden in the most unexpected places. The influence of intelligence on the outcome of the battle for Lemberg can hardly be overestimated. Timely received data about the impending Austrian counterattack allowed the Russian command to regroup forces and avoid encirclement. And precise information about the location of Russian reserves helped the Austrians strike at the most vulnerable point. The Polish population of Galicia met the beginning of the battle for Lemberg with anxious anticipation. For Poles, who constituted a significant part of the urban elite and intelligentsia, this conflict had a special dimension. They found themselves between the hammer and the anvil of two empires, each of which promised them certain privileges in exchange for loyalty. The Austro-Hungarian monarchy granted Poles broad cultural autonomy, allowing them to hold high administrative positions and develop national culture. Many Poles sat in the Galician Sejm and even in the imperial parliament in Vienna. The Russian Empire, in turn, played on pan-Slavic sentiments and promised the unification of all Polish lands under the scepter of the Romanovs with the granting of autonomy. In the first days of September 1914, as Russian troops approached Lemberg, Polish society split. Count Stanislaw Szeptycki, a prominent representative of the Polish aristocracy, formed a volunteer detachment to defend the city as part of the Austrian forces. Simultaneously, the writer Tadeusz Rilski publicly welcomed the approaching Russian army as a step towards the reunification of the Polish people. A special role in the events was played by the Polish legions, under the command of Józef Piłsudski, fighting on the side of Austria-Hungary. For them, the war became an opportunity to assert Polish national interests and demonstrate the combat effectiveness of Polish military formations. The legionaries distinguished themselves in battles on the approaches to Lemberg, showing exceptional bravery in defending the northern suburbs. When Russian troops entered the city, the attitude of the Polish population towards them was ambiguous. Jagiellonian University professor Kazimierz Morawski recalled, "Some closed their shutters and hid in cellars. Others went out into the streets with bread and salt. No one knew what to expect from the new authorities." The Russian command, understanding the complexity of the situation, sought to pursue a balanced policy. General Rutsky issued an order guaranteeing the inviolability of private property and respect for the religious feelings of the Catholic population. Many Polish officials were left in their positions on condition of pledging allegiance to the Russian emperor. However, a Russification campaign began in parallel. Double-headed eagles appeared on administrative buildings, and Russian was introduced in schools. The political hopes of Poles during this period centered around the appeal of Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich from August 14th, in which he promised the reunification of Polish lands under the scepter of the Romanovs. The document caused a surge of pro-Russian sentiment among a part of the Polish intelligentsia. The famous writer Henryk Sienkiewicz, who was in Switzerland at the time, sent a telegram in support of the Russian army, seeing it as the liberator of the Polish people. For ordinary Poles of Lemberg, military actions primarily meant the hardships of everyday life. Maria Dąbrowska recorded in her diary, "Bread disappeared from the shops, water is supplied 2 hours a day. Wounded and refugees appeared on the streets. The city, always so elegant and cheerful, plunged into an anxious stupor." The situation of mixed families, where husband and wife belonged to different ethnic groups, was particularly difficult. Choosing a side in the conflict often meant betrayal of relatives. With the arrival of Russian troops, many Poles saw an opportunity for career advancement. Lawyer Stanislaw Grabski, who was fluent in Russian, became an advisor to the new administration. Such people caused an ambiguous reaction in society. Some considered them pragmatists, others traitors. When Austrian troops regained control of the city in June 1915, repression against Russophiles began. Many Poles who collaborated with the Russian administration were arrested or fled eastward. The Ukrainian question in Galicia at the beginning of the 20th century presented an extremely complex political puzzle. Unlike the Poles, who constituted the urban elite, Ukrainians were predominantly a rural population, yet their national self-awareness was growing rapidly. By the time the battle for Lemberg began, the Ukrainian movement in Galicia already possessed its own cultural organizations, political parties, and educational institutions. Austro-Hungarian authorities, following the principle of divide and conquer, provided certain support to Ukrainian aspirations in opposition to Polish ambitions. This allowed for the establishment of Ukrainian gymnasiums in Lemberg, a department of Ukrainian language at the university, and even representation in the Galician Sejm. With the outbreak of hostilities, the Ukrainian population faced a difficult choice: Dr. Kost Levitsky, leader of the Ukrainian National Democratic Party, publicly declared support for Austria-Hungary, seeing it as the lesser evil compared to the Russian Empire, where the Ukrainian language was banned and the very concept of Ukrainian was not officially recognized. Under his leadership, the main Ukrainian Council, a political body representing the interests of Galician Ukrainians, was established in August 1914. The most vivid manifestation of Ukrainian military aspirations was the formation of the Legion of Ukrainian Sich Riflemen, USS, a volunteer unit within the Austrian army. Historian Mykola Holubets wrote, "When recruitment was announced, over 28,000 volunteers signed up in 2 days, although Austrian authorities only permitted 2,000 to be accepted." The Sich riflemen distinguished themselves in battles near Lemberg, especially in the defense of the city's southern approaches. Commander of the 1st 100 USS, Vasil Didushak, recalled, "We fought not for Emperor Franz Joseph, but for a future free Ukraine." Each of us understood that this was the first Ukrainian national army in centuries. The Russian command, recognizing the complexity of the ethnic issue in Galicia, attempted to pursue a flexible policy. General Alexei Brusilov, who commanded the 8th Army, forbade his officers from using the term mazepinci in reference to local Ukrainians, understanding its offensive nature. However, simultaneously, officials arrived in the occupied territories, implementing a policy of Russification. Count Georgy Bobrinsky, appointed Governor-General of Galicia, stated in his programmatic speech, "Eastern Galicia and Lemkivshchina are ancient Russian lands. The Russian order must be restored in these territories." Ukrainian schools and cultural societies were closed, and Ukrainian-language newspapers were banned. Many Ukrainian activists were arrested and exiled deep into Russia. Metropolitan Andrei Sheptitsky, the spiritual leader of Ukrainian Greek Catholics, was interned in Suzdal for refusing to call his flock to loyalty to the Russian Tsar. The rural Ukrainian population reacted to the change of power with cautious pragmatism. Peasants, exhausted by military requisitions from the Austrian army, initially greeted Russian troops with hopes of relief from their burdens. However, they soon became disillusioned, encountering new levies. Attempts to interfere in religious life, the desire to convert Greek Catholics to Orthodoxy, were particularly painful. When Austrian troops regained control of Lemberg in June 1915, repressions began against Moscowphiles, Ukrainians who collaborated with the Russian administration. Thousands of people were arrested and sent to the Tallerhof concentration camp, where many died from hunger and disease. The battle for Lemberg had far-reaching consequences for the Ukrainian national movement. Historian Ivan Krypiakevich noted, "The war shattered illusions about the possibility of resolving the Ukrainian question within the framework of existing empires. It became evident that only a state of their own could ensure national development." The experience of the Ukrainian Sich riflemen became an important stage in the formation of national military traditions. Many USS veterans subsequently formed the core of the Ukrainian Galician Army, which fought for independence in 1918–20. Thus, the battle for Lemberg, which began as a clash of empires, became a catalyst for Ukrainian national awakening, laying the foundation for future state aspirations. The German General Staff closely watched the developments in Galicia with intense attention. For Berlin's strategists, the Battle of Lemberg was not just another engagement on the Eastern Front. It represented the first serious test for their main ally. Colonel Max Hoffmann, one of the leading experts on the Russian army, received daily detailed reports from the theater of war and compiled analytical notes for the High Command. In his diary, he wrote, "General Erich von Falkenhayn, chief of the German General Staff, after receiving news of the critical situation of the Austrians, convened an emergency meeting. The best minds of German military thought were present. The discussion was heated. Some officers proposed immediately transferring several divisions from France to stabilize the front. Others insisted on maintaining the priority of the western direction. The outcome of the meeting was a compromise. Germany would not transfer large forces to the east, but would reinforce the Austrians with artillery and technical specialists. Additionally, it was decided to send a group of liaison officers to the staff of the Austrian army to improve coordination of actions. Kaiser Wilhelm II himself showed keen interest in the battle for Lemberg. Upon receiving news of the first successes of the Russian troops, he sent a personal telegram to Emperor Franz Joseph. However, in private conversations, the Kaiser was less diplomatic. General Moritz von Linker recalled how Wilhelm furiously threw a map of Galicia onto the table and exclaimed, "German military analysts drew several important lessons from the Battle of Lemberg. Firstly, they noted an underestimation of the Russian army, its maneuverability, the quality of its artillery, and the resilience of its infantry. Secondly, the need for a unified command on the Eastern Front became evident. Thirdly, serious problems were revealed in the multinational Austro-Hungarian army, where regiments of different nationalities showed varying degrees of steadfastness. Major General Alfred Krauss, sent as an observer to the staff of the Austrian army, wrote in his report, "After the fall of Lemberg, the German General Staff began developing a plan for a major counteroffensive on the Eastern Front. Colonel Hoffmann proposed the concept of a deep breakthrough at the junction of Russian armies, followed by the encirclement of large groupings. This plan, codenamed, formed the basis of the future Gorlice-Tarnów offensive in the spring of 1915. An important consequence of the Battle of Lemberg was the change in relations between Germany and Austria-Hungary. Berlin began to intervene more actively in the Allies' military planning, gradually subordinating the Austrian command to its influence. Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg later remarked, "After Lemberg, we realized that we had to take control of the Eastern Front, otherwise the Russians would reach Vienna." While the fate of the Eastern Front was being decided on the fields of Galicia, French military experts closely followed the unfolding events. For the French General Staff, the Battle of Lemberg was of exceptional interest. It was the first large-scale engagement in the East, capable of drawing significant German army forces away from the offensive on Paris. Colonel Henri Mordac, head of the analytical department of French intelligence, received daily telegrams with details of the battle. In his diary, he noted, "The Russian offensive in Galicia demonstrates astonishing effectiveness. If they continue in the same vein, the Austrians will be forced to request German assistance, which will inevitably weaken the pressure on our front." The tactics of the Russian troops were of particular interest to the French military. General Joseph Joffre, commander-in-chief of the French army, ordered the creation of a special commission to study the experience of Lemberg. It was headed by Colonel Maxime Weygand, a future prominent military leader. The commission identified several key aspects of Russian tactics that differed from conventional Western patterns. Firstly, the French noted the effective use by the Russians of massive artillery strikes followed by infantry attacks in waves. This tactic sharply contrasted with the German doctrine on the Western Front, where attacks were carried out in more compact groups. Colonel Weygand wrote in his report, "The Russians demonstrate an amazing ability to concentrate firepower on narrow sectors of the front, creating overwhelming superiority at critical points." Secondly, French experts were impressed by the skillful use of cavalry by the Russians for deep raids into the enemy's rear. On the Western Front, cavalry quickly lost its significance, encountering dense trench lines and machine gun nests. However, in the more open spaces of Galicia, General Dragomirov's Cossack units successfully disrupted Austrian communications and created panic in their rear. The experience of urban combat in Lemberg proved to be most valuable for the French. Captain Charles de Gaulle, a young officer attached to Weygand's commission, compiled a detailed analysis of assault group tactics. He particularly highlighted the method of, quote, when small detachments of Russian soldiers penetrated through weak points in the defense and attacked the enemy from the flanks and rear. This approach differed significantly from the frontal attacks practiced in the West. Comparing the combat operations on the two fronts, French analysts noted fundamental differences. Major Louis Franchet d'Espèrey wrote, "In the West, the war quickly turned into a positional stalemate with continuous lines of trenches from the English Channel to Switzerland. In Galicia, however, we see a much more mobile front with deep breakthroughs and flanking maneuvers." The conclusions of the French Military Commission had a noticeable impact on the evolution of the Third Republic's military doctrine. General Joffre, after reviewing the reports, initiated a revision of tactical instructions for infantry units. Particular attention was paid to coordinating artillery and infantry actions, as well as preparing for urban combat. In practical terms, the lessons of Lemberg were reflected in the planning of the Champagne offensive in the spring of 1915. The French command attempted to apply the Russian experience of massive artillery preparation, followed by an echeloned infantry assault. Although the operation did not achieve decisive success, it demonstrated the French desire to adapt Eastern experience to the realities of the Western Front. On September 3, 1914, Russian troops solemnly entered Lemberg. Church bells accompanied the advance of the vanguard through the central streets. General Ruzsky, seated on a white horse, received the symbolic keys to the city from the remaining municipal officials. A new era in the history of the Galician capital had begun. The very next day, the staff of the Russian administration was quartered in the former palace of the Austrian governor. Count Georgy Bobrinsky, an experienced administrator with conservative views, was appointed Governor-General of Galicia. In his first proclamation, he declared, "Eastern Galicia has always been an indigenous part of a united Great Russia. The indigenous population in these lands has always been Russian." The Russian authorities immediately set about transforming urban life. Double-headed eagles replaced Habsburg eagles on administrative buildings. Portraits of Emperor Nicholas II appeared in public offices. The city police were disbanded and replaced by Russian gendarmes. Austrian officials who had not managed to evacuate were removed from their posts, although some of them, especially Poles, were offered to retain their positions on condition of pledging allegiance to the Russian Tsar. Particular attention was paid to the religious question. Orthodoxy was declared the returning religion of the region. Orthodox priests were appointed to Greek Catholic churches. Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky, who refused to cooperate with the new authorities, was arrested and taken to Kiev, and then to Suzdal. His place was taken by Archbishop Evlogi, who vigorously undertook the return of the Uniates to the bosom of the Orthodox Church. The economic life of the city underwent radical changes. The ruble replaced the Austrian krona as the official currency. Banks came under the control of Russian financial inspectors. Trade ties with Vienna and Budapest were severed, which caused a temporary shortage of some goods. However, supplies from the inner provinces of Russia were soon established. The Russian administration pursued a differentiated policy towards various ethnic groups. Poles, who constituted a significant part of the urban elite, received certain privileges. They were allowed to maintain their cultural institutions, schools, and newspapers. This was explained by Russia's desire to win over the Poles in the context of the promised autonomy for a united Poland. The attitude towards Ukrainians was completely different. The very term Ukrainian was forbidden for use in official documents. Instead, the concept of Little Russian, or simply Russian, was used. Ukrainian schools and cultural societies were closed. Activists of the Ukrainian movement were arrested and deported. Kiev professor Nikolai Vasilenko, who visited Lemberg in October 1914, noted with bitterness, "Here a tragedy is taking place for an entire people, who are even denied the right to their own name." The Jewish population of the city found itself in a particularly difficult situation. In the Russian Empire, numerous restrictions applied to Jews, including the Pale of Settlement. Some Cossack units that entered the city carried out pogroms in Jewish quarters. General Ruzsky was forced to issue a special order prohibiting violence against the civilian population, but tensions persisted. The daily life of the townspeople changed beyond recognition. A curfew was imposed from 8 in the evening. Special passes were required for movement between districts. Theaters and cinemas operated with restrictions. In schools, the compulsory study of the Russian language and Russian history was introduced. Even shop signs had to be replaced with bilingual ones, Russian, Polish. The spring of 1915 brought drastic changes to the situation on the Eastern Front. The Austro-Hungarian command, having received significant support from their German allies, developed a plan for a large-scale counter-offensive with the goal of retaking Lemberg, the jewel of Galicia. The operation was codenamed May Storm and was prepared in an atmosphere of strict secrecy. General August von Mackensen, an experienced German military leader, was appointed head of the combined group of forces. Under his command, a strike force of 11 divisions, reinforced by heavy artillery of the latest models, was concentrated. The Russian command, which had focused its main efforts on the Carpathian direction, failed to timely identify the scale of the enemy's preparations. On May 2nd, the artillery of the Central Powers opened hurricane fire on the positions of the Third Russian Army. More than 700 guns of various calibers unleashed a veritable storm of metal upon the Russian trenches. Eyewitnesses recalled that the ground trembled as if in an earthquake, and the roar was heard for tens of kilometers. After a 4-hour artillery preparation, the infantry advanced. German assault groups, using new infiltration tactics, seeped through weak points in the Russian defense and attacked from the flanks. Austrian units followed, consolidating the success. The Russian troops, exhausted by previous battles and experiencing an acute shortage of shells, could not withstand the onslaught. In the first 3 days of the offensive, the Austro-German forces advanced 30 kilometers, breaking through the front on a wide sector. General Radko Dmitriev, commander of the Third Army, requested permission to retreat, but Stavka delayed the decision, fearing the loss of strategically important positions. When permission finally arrived, it was too late. A significant part of the army was under threat of encirclement. The Russians had to retreat in haste, abandoning heavy weaponry and convoys. By mid-May, Austro-German troops reached the approaches to Lemberg. The city, which had been under Russian control for almost 9 months, was preparing for new trials. The Russian administration hastily evacuated, taking valuables and archives. Along with them, those who actively collaborated with the Russian authorities left the city, fearing reprisals. On June 22nd, Austrian troops entered Lemberg almost without a fight. The Russian command decided not to turn the city into a battlefield to avoid destruction and civilian casualties. Austrian cavalry was the first to enter the city streets, met by the jubilation of some residents. Polish and Ukrainian flags appeared on many buildings. The return of Austrian rule was accompanied by a wave of repressions against Russophiles. Hundreds of people suspected of collaborating with the Russian administration were arrested. Ukrainian Muscophiles suffered particularly heavily, being sent to the infamous Thalerhof concentration camp. The Austrian authorities sought to quickly restore the pre-war order. Portraits of Emperor Franz Joseph returned to government offices. The krone once again became the official currency. Schools resumed work with instruction in Polish and Ukrainian. However, the economic situation remained difficult. The city experienced an acute shortage of food and fuel. Military needs consumed most of the resources. Ration cards for basic foodstuffs were introduced. Despite the formal restoration of its pre-war status, Lemberg was never the same. The experience of the Russian occupation and subsequent liberation deeply divided society. Contradictions between various ethnic groups intensified. The split within the Ukrainian movement into Austrophiles and Russophiles became particularly noticeable. The return of Austro-Hungarian control over Lemberg had important strategic significance. The Central Powers regained an important transportation hub and industrial center. The front line moved eastward, allowing the Austrians to transfer some forces to the Italian front, where a new threat was brewing. For the Russian Empire, the loss of Lemberg was a painful blow, symbolizing the beginning of the Great Retreat of the Russian army in the summer of 1915. New battles lay ahead, new twists in the fate of the long-suffering city, which found itself at the crossroads of empires. The Battle of Lemberg became a true laboratory of military art, where classical 19th-century doctrines clashed with the nascent tendencies of future wars. Military theorists from all countries meticulously studied the experience of this battle, drawing lessons that subsequently changed approaches to warfare. One of the key discoveries was the realization of the increased role of artillery as the main striking force. Lieutenant General Nikolai Golovin, analyzing the battle, noted, "Lemberg showed that modern combat is won not by those who have more bayonets, but by those who can create superiority in firepower in the decisive direction." The Russian army demonstrated an innovative approach to massing artillery, concentrating up to 100 guns per kilometer of front during a breakthrough. This experience was subsequently developed in other theaters of war. The Austrian command learned an important lesson from the defeat about the necessity of deeply echeloned defense. If before Lemberg, the main emphasis was on holding the forward line of trenches, after it, active construction of second and third lines with intermediate strongpoints began. Colonel Franz Geyer wrote in his analytical report, "Defense must not be a line, but a system capable of absorbing enemy blows and maintaining stability even with local breakthroughs." Military experts paid particular attention to the tactics of urban combat demonstrated in Lemberg. Here, principles were born that later became classics of military art: division into assault groups, the use of underground communications, and the use of light artillery for direct infantry support. Comparing the Battle of Lemberg with other battles of the First World War, one can note its unique position. Unlike the positional battles on the Western Front, high maneuverability was maintained here. Unlike the campaigns in the Balkans, here, large masses of troops acted with the use of all arms. British military historian Basil Liddell Hart called the Battle of Galicia the last classical battle and the first modern operation. Lemberg became a testing ground for new types of weapons. Field telephones were widely used for the first time to coordinate the actions of artillery and infantry. Aviation, albeit in its infancy, was already used for reconnaissance and fire adjustment. Russian troops for the first time massively used domestically produced hand grenades, and the Austrians used light mortars, indispensable in urban conditions. An important lesson was the realization of the role of transport infrastructure. Control over the Lemberg railway hub gave a decisive advantage in maneuvering reserves. After this battle, all warring parties began to pay paramount attention to railways, creating specialized railway troops and developing field narrow-gauge lines. The Battle of Lemberg also forced a review of the principles of medical support. For the first time, an echeloned system for evacuating the wounded was widely applied. Regimental aid posts, divisional hospitals, army hospitals, rear hospitals. This significantly reduced mortality among the wounded compared to previous conflicts. German military theorist Hans von Seeckt, analyzing the experience of Lemberg, formulated the concept of elastic defense, which subsequently became the basis of the German defensive doctrine. Its essence lay in the conscious allowance for tactical breakthroughs with subsequent encirclement and destruction of the intruding enemy by counterattacks of reserves. The city of Lemberg, which changed hands many times during the First World War, forever remained in the historical memory of the peoples of Central and Eastern Europe. Today, this city is known to the world as Lviv, the cultural capital of Western Ukraine, but echoes of past battles are still felt in its architecture, culture, and the collective memory of its inhabitants. For Poles, Lemberg-Lviv remained a symbol of lost Eastern Kresy, territories that for centuries were part of the Polish state. In the interwar period, when the city was part of the Second Polish Republic, Polish cultural institutions were actively restored here, and new schools and universities were opened. The Jan Kazimierz University of Lviv became one of the leading scientific centers in Eastern Europe. For Ukrainians, the battle for Lemberg became an important stage in the formation of national self-awareness. The experience of the Ukrainian Sikh riflemen who fought for the city formed the basis of the military traditions of future Ukrainian statehood. After the war, despite Lviv becoming part of Poland, it remained the unofficial capital of the Ukrainian movement in Galicia. Underground organizations operated here, Ukrainian-language newspapers were published, and a national intelligentsia was formed. Austrians recall Lemberg with nostalgic sadness, as the last glimmer of imperial grandeur before the collapse of the centuries-old Habsburg monarchy. Viennese museums house paintings and photographs of the city, capturing its appearance in the last peaceful years. For many Austrian families, Lemberg remained a place where their ancestors, who fell in battles for the empire's eastern frontiers, rest. For Russians, Lemberg became a symbol of unfulfilled hopes for the unification of, quote, the brief control over the city was perceived as a triumph of historical justice, the return of Galician Rus to the bosom of Mother Russia. The subsequent loss of the city during the Great Retreat intensified the general disappointment in the military efforts of the Tsarist government. Today, the memory of the battle for Lemberg is reflected differently in the historical narratives of various countries. Polish historiography emphasizes the heroism of Polish legionnaires who defended the city. Ukrainian historians focus on the formation of national military units and the first experience of state-building. Russian researchers consider the Galician operation as an example of a successful offensive by the Russian army, overshadowed by the subsequent retreat due to a shortage of shells. Lviv today is a living open-air museum where Austrian, Polish, Ukrainian, and Jewish cultural traditions are intricately intertwined. Majestic buildings from the Austrian era stand alongside Polish churches, Ukrainian churches, and the remnants of Jewish synagogues. Every stone here remembers the roar of the cannons of that distant war, which changed the destinies of entire peoples.